In our last episode, we interviewed our very first guest, James Ballard of the Hidden Orchard Project, who introduced us to the world of Jewish mysticism, particularly as it relates to the teaching of Yeshua, Jesus, in the New Testament writings. He had so many engaging ideas to share that we simply couldn't fit them all into one episode. So, we invited him back to share more of his thoughts with us. Now, as a trigger warning, some of the ideas you hear will be provocative.
We're on the edge of Messiah's arrival, according to Jewish tradition.
Some statements will be bold.
Messianic Judaism has to, at some point, evolve past the frameworks handed to it from the church.
Some will be daring.
We've entered the window where Gentiles need to learn the Kabbalah.
Everything will most definitely be enlightening.
Paul was under the assumption that that Messianic era was happening in his day. All of his writings indicate that he thought we're minutes away from this. So he's teaching very deep Kabbalistic concepts, Paul.
And some of what you hear will even be prophetic.
Some parts of the church play dangerously in that space of prophetic tongues, and you're still playing in the space of some entities that are not so helpful to you, and you can get messed up.
Join us in this installment for part 2 of our interview with James Ballard.
And today we'll be returning for part 2 of our interview with our own native Kabbalist, James Ballard. But first, we'll return to the news story that's on everyone's mind: Israel's campaign against Hamas and the tragic events, the massacre of October 7th. Take it away.
All right. Well, we talked about this last time, but it's still in the news and probably will be in the news cycle for quite some time. And again, I want to talk about this this tragic incident in Israel where these terrorists known as Hamas, and we talked about what that word meant in our last episode, and I don't want to rehash that, but I want to continue looking at this from a spiritual aspect, because it's just pure evil. But one of the things that when I think about what's going on here in Israel with the Palestinians and Hamas pretending to be the friends of the Palestinians, which they're really just an arm, a proxy for Iran. What I think we're witnessing is there's a parallel here. We're just seeing out when I say parallel, I mean a scriptural parallel. We're seeing a playing out of the continuous struggle between Ishmael and Isaac.
Yeah. And, I've heard there was once a man who, he was a former Muslim, but what he said essentially, and I'm not going to provide pop psychology as to why people do these kinds of things, but he said essentially that, when God said, through no fault of his own perhaps, that Ishmael, you're not the son of the covenant, and send him off into the desert. God looked after him. He loved Ishmael, I think. But at the same time, I heard this Muslim once explain that because of that, Arab peoples have always felt like second fiddle or something about that story is very slighting to them, and maybe that makes them feel like I'm chopped liver or what have you. And of course, I think from the Quranic perspective, it was the exact opposite. They wrote the story to be Isaac was not the favorite, but it was Ishmael, or not the favorite, but the inheritor of the blessing, essentially, and that was the line through which God's revelation came. So it's an alternate story, but I think you also said Amalek. And I think that's probably more appropriate.
Well, in our previous conversations, I have mentioned that another parallel I see is not just the struggle between Isaac and Ishmael, but I see a parallel with the story of Amalek, because God said that he is forever at war with Amalek. And that if you recall, when the children of Israel came out of Egypt and they crossed the Red Sea and they were wandering through the wilderness, before they got to Mount Sinai, according to the story in the book of Exodus, they were attacked by Amalek. But it wasn't a frontal assault from Amalek.
Picking off the old.
They
and
were
the sick,
attacking the rear and picking off the vulnerable,
just like jackals,
the sick, the young, the elderly, the stragglers, the weak. They were picking those people off, and that's what we saw with Hamas in their attack of Israeli citizens. They didn't go after the army. I mean, they kind of did. They caught them by surprise, but for the most part, they went after civilian
targets. That was their main
and unarmed civilians.
Yeah,
and particularly the elderly, the children, the defenseless. That's who they went after. So I see a parallel with Amalek there, and God counted that as extremely wicked. I mean, He wanted Amalek to be destroyed, to be wiped from the face of the earth.
It was, and of course, the Amalekites are no longer a distinct people on the planet right now. I mean, you're never going to meet a Hittite, probably. You're never going to meet an extant, I don't know, I'm thinking of some other ancient Jebusite or what have you, or you're not going to meet those people anymore. They're just no longer a distinct people group on the planet. So Amalek in broader, I guess more modern Judaism has taken on the valence less of a people and more of a spirit. And I say spirit not in the sense of like demonic or anything like that, but just a general attitude of almost chinat sinam, or baseless hatred towards the Jewish people, but maybe not even the Jewish people, but just a cruelty, a vicious cruelty that has no basis for it doesn't exist. It doesn't have any underlying basis. It's just done out of pure spite or pure meanness with no cause whatsoever, but cruelty for cruelty's own sake. It's like this empty fire. And so Amalek, appears in every generation. Amalek appeared in the book of Esther with Haman, who tried to wipe out the Jewish people by decree of Xerxes.
He was an Agagite, and we know that
Agagite was
he was meaning a descendant of Agag, and Agag was the king of Amalek, who King Saul was supposed to kill.
Yeah,
and
he did.
Let them alive, and supposedly by tradition he got his wife impregnated, and she went off and had a son. Even after Agag was killed, he'd already impregnated his wife, and eventually one of his descendants became Haman.
Yeah. So either way, it's just troubling. And so you were going to say something else, David.
Well, I want to pick up from where you left off. You talked about it just being a form of baseless hatred, and just this intense antagonism. And what I see there, I would label it as a form of covetousness, because you mentioned earlier about the blessing. You said there's a slight there. When you read it in Scripture, it's almost like a slight towards the Arab peoples.
We didn't measure up,
right? Because they weren't the chosen; they were second fiddle, so to speak. And there's this. What I think may be a form of covetousness. And if you think about, what is covetousness? Well, it's envying what someone else has. It's wanting what someone else has. But even more, it goes beyond that. I love what Rabbi Sachs, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, the late, great Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, one of my favorite modern authors and commentators. He said that covetousness is really wanting not just what somebody else has, but wanting to be someone else. You want to take their place, so to speak, and become that person. So that's why when I look at this, I'm thinking, well, that's really what they're wanting to do.
That's what Ishmael wants.
They're trying to usurp the Jewish people. They're trying to become the chosen people.
Yeah. That's what historically. I mean, I guess midrashically you could say Ishmael would want that, but Amalek doesn't want anything. He just wants to cause pain. So
Right.
there seems to be sort of like a homiletic distinction.
Right. This is multifaceted.
Yeah, it's got some angles to it.
Continuing on this line of thought, if we think of this as multifaceted, I could keep turning that gemstone and look at it from another angle and another angle. For example, when I look at this, I see another concept at play that Jonathan Sachs talks about, which is what he calls altruistic evil.
What's that?
Altruistic evil is a perversion of true altruism. Instead of we know what altruism is. It's
benevolence towards others.
Towards others and laying down, my own needs and concerns to care for others.
Mm-hmm.
This is the exact opposite. I mean, it's evil for evil's sake, to be just pure evil and thinking you're doing it in the name of God.
Well, yeah, and you either have to distort God in order to kind of fit that round peg into a square hole, or vice versa. But maybe that would probably more aptly describe the college students and the protesters here in the U.S. Maybe Amalek overseas in Gaza and with Hamas, they know what they're doing is evil. They maybe they're aware of it and they're just vicious. But you have these college students that are sort of, robed in idealism, as they tend to be, and they approach this but we care about the Palestinians, we care about colonized peoples, we care about the rights of the disenfranchised, and that's how they cloak it. But they everything. Whenever it's talked about that 1,400 Jews were massacred in what is perhaps the most violent, horrendous thing perpetrated against the Jewish people since the Holocaust, they always say, "Oh yeah, that's kind of bad," and however, and that's not something that you really color with the word. It's not something you color with qualification, as I said in my last statement on the previous podcast. You just have to say it's bad. You can't put an asterisk next to it. You can't color it with maybe.
No, you can't.
Yeah.
And if I can expand on that idea, the college kids and the people that want to make a moral equivalence, really what they're talking about, or what they're trying to get to, is this idea of victim culture.
Yeah.
And I don't see, what they're trying to say is that the Palestinians, they're victims.
Yeah.
And they want to see everyone as divide everyone into two groups, oppressors and victims.
Yeah.
But
I think that naturally they see, well, if this person, or this government, or this people right over here is poorer and has less military strength, then somehow they're oppressed, and the person closest to them, or the state closest to them, I should say, is the oppressor, and it's a very morally facile way of analyzing reality. You have a poor nation, or it's not really a nation, but you have a let's just say, for brevity's sake, it is. You have a poor nation that's militarily weaker next to a stronger nation that's more prosperous and has more military strength. We just assume that the poorer, weaker one is the oppressed, and that's not always the case. I can't think. It's hard for me to imagine that you have highly educated people, Ivy Leaguers, that just don't have. I mean, they might have very high IQs to pass, to pass the SAT. You take the MCAT, whatever. But at the same time, it's like just basic critical analysis of it's like they're phoning it out.
Right. High IQ is not a mark of wisdom.
No.
Yeah. Being the smartest person in the room does not mean that you're wise.
It means you have a fast processor. It doesn't mean that you
right.
use it correctly. And so,
well, here's the problem I see with victim culture. You could argue that
that it denies people their humanity, because a victim is an object, not a subject,
Yeah.
a done to rather than a doer.
Yeah.
So in a victim culture, victims are allowed to deny their responsibility. And those who encourage them to do so become codependents.
Yeah.
So that's what we're looking at with these college kids and these academics,
Enablers, yeah.
Yes. And so when we allow them to place blame on someone else for their problems, these so-called victims, they're allowed to perpetuate their condition. And instead of helping them, those who encourage their victimhood status basically lock them up in prison.
Yeah,
They put them in a type of prison when they do that.
Yeah.
They can't escape from that reality.
Vicious cycle that
this
they've perpetuated.
cycle
Yeah.
to face the reality of their problem and to break out of that victimhood.
Well, I mean, you talk about the cycle. This is where, like, of course, I don't want anything bad to happen to the Palestinian people per se, and I hope that when Israel storms into there, that they minimize casualties as best they can. Obviously, Hamas should no longer exist. But I'm not sure, and I don't know if this is more controversial, but I'm not sure if the Palestinian people themselves are totally blameless in all this, in so much that, one, their poverty in their living standard is largely a reflection of their own choices. They elected Hamas.
Right.
And after Hamas did this, to my understanding, they had various pollings that were conducted, I think, in the Gaza Strip area. What they did was still very popular. These were the same people that were out in the street trilling when, 9/11, when 3,000 people died in New York City. And so what Hamas does enjoys popular support amongst a broad base of Palestinians themselves. And so they knew the platform of Hamas, to my understanding. They willfully elected it. And then when the United Nations, the international community, the United States, God forbid, sends aid to that region, Hamas will then appropriate that. And they're not going to spend it on plumbing or internet access or education or anything like that. They're going to spend it on recruitment and bombs and missiles and those types of things. So
they could be essentially a sovereign state if they wanted it to. They get all of this aid. And
it could be investment.
It could be investment in their own infrastructure, but instead they have to rely on electricity from Israel and water from Israel. They could be developing desalination plants and their own power plants in order to make themselves self-sufficient.
I mean,
but instead, like you said, they spend all their money on bombs.
UAE, United Arab Emirates, Dubai. You have places throughout the Middle East that have also, Muslim countries that have become prosperous by their own investment and by embracing the future. And so it's like, well, they could do that too. But so I think they've for the most part immiserated themselves. So I don't think that I don't want anything bad to happen to them, but at the same time, I don't think they're I can't hold them completely harmless in this situation either.
Right.
If they, and so, to believe the things that they believe, a generation of people have been brainwashed. You see that Google sometime, if you get a chance, Palestinian children's cartoons, because in schools in Palestine, Palestine, I use that word in scare quotes, in schools there, they teach anti-Semitism, and they don't recognize the state of Israel, and they teach that to young kids. And they take it further by, in kids' cartoons, zoologically depicting Jewish people and encouraging violence against them. And then, of course, these kids are brought to rallies where they'll talk, they'll hold these kids on their shoulders and put these militant headbands on them, and this is our next generation, and so forth. And so this cause perpetually is all around them, and they're selling their kids' future, up the river, on a lost cause that's never going to materialize for them. And even if it does materialize for the kids, and God forbid they do drive the Jewish people into the sea, God forbid, it's not going to make their lives any better at all. And so it's almost like there's this intergenerational mass psychosis, and like I don't know what will break it, because you can go in and you can shatter Hamas and completely uproot it, but I don't know what's going to stop them from not just going into the polls and electing another Hamas by under another name. And that would mean that Israel would have to occupy them and I don't know, hand them a constitution like we did Japan or something. I don't know, but it seems like what breaks the wheel. I have no idea.
Yeah, I don't know what the answer is. Mm-hmm. I really don't. I mean, I wish that. I mean, this is something that's been going on for decades now, over 100 years. Yeah. This issue has been going on. Most experts have said that the solution is to have two states. Mm. But the Palestinians have made it clear they don't want a second state.
If you wanted a second state, you would be taking that aid and investing it in a second state,
right?
But you're not. You're investing. You're investing it in trying to destroy the next door neighbor state. And that's pretty much. Right. So that's your priority, not actually being something of your own.
It began with the Peel Commission in 1936, 1937, when the British were trying to figure out, okay, well, what's the solution here? Mm-hmm. Because before it was the entire area, what we know as Israel, including the so-called occupied territories, plus Jordan. All of that was considered Palestine at the time of the British Mandate. Mm-hmm. And then I think was it 1922? I think it was. They broke off everything on the east bank of the Jordan River and gave that to the Hashemite kingdom.
Yeah.
That we're seeing now the fourth generation of that king. I forget what his name is. King Abdullah.
Yeah.
But then that became what was left was just a sliver of that entire area, and the British were trying to figure, okay, what do we do with this part of this land? And that was supposed to go to Israel. Okay, we took this tiny sliver, we're going to give it to Israel. And then in the 1936 Peel Commission, they decided, well, we're going to split even that up and give a portion of it to the Jewish people and the rest of it to the Arabs. Yeah. And the Arabs made it clear they didn't want a second state. And then the British eventually handed it off to the UN. The UN essentially came to the same conclusion. So in 1947, that's what they had decided. In 1948, the UN voted to award statehood to Israel. Israel declared itself a state right after that, and then immediately all the Arab nations attacked.
All of a sudden, now they want it.
We don't want two states. And then suddenly in 1966, 6-ish there, 64, 65, 66, suddenly the PLO is formed, declaring itself, we want a homeland for the Palestinians. Wasn't that way back then in 1936 and 48 when it was offered to you, you said you didn't want it, and now suddenly you want it?
Yeah. It's like when your younger brother gets your toys and like you were never playing with them, but all of a sudden you're freaking out because like, why is he playing with my toys? You want something when somebody else has it, not because you yourself want it. It's a sad topic, and I don't know how much more it's going to linger within the news cycle here at MJ Next, but we'll discuss it for as long as we think we need to. And I'm really happy, and we can segue to something much, much lighter and something much more just yummy and enjoyable to take our minds off this stuff. So we're pulling it back home to the core of today's show and the previous show, which is the main segment, our sit-down interview with James Ballard, our Kabbalistic thinker. And as we said before, before we embark, I want two things to be clear. We at MJ Next, we always strive for open-mindedness. We have diverse voices in our midst. And the opinions expressed here are not always ours. They might be ours. Maybe we'll tell you. Maybe we won't. I don't know. But we try our best to give give voice to a wide range of voices. And so, too, whatever your opinions are, if you don't agree with what you hear on this show, maybe you have a more conventional view of things, we might be a bit more far out for you. I don't know. We still will try to regard you and give you the benefit of the doubt as though you're acting in good faith and you're a good person and, you have a good relationship, vertical relationship with God. And so, that said, I guess we can launch into it. Now to return to last week's topic, the main theme of today's podcast. In the previous podcast, we uncorked a rollicking discussion with James Ballard of Tikvat David about Jewish mysticism. And this episode continues where we last left off. For that reason, I will take a brief moment to reintroduce him. So we have a very special guest today, and he's a fellow member of Tikvat David. Please allow us to introduce our friend, James Ballard. He's a husband and father of 3, a former DJ, a Messianic Jew, and though Jewish by birth, he grew up in Catholicism and eventually found his way back to his Jewish roots. Today, James is the published author of Exploration of the Soul, Discovering the Nature of the Human Soul Through the Wisdom of the Bible and Jewish Literature. He's also the founder and curator of the Hidden Orchard Project, an online hub for blog articles, podcasts, and various resources in Jewish wisdom. The Hidden Orchard Project offers a fresh look at spirituality, the Bible, emerging sciences, wellness, meditation, and a wide array of relevant topics. Discover more at thehiddenorchard.com. Here at Tikvat, James possesses a talent for framing the New Testament within the first century Jewish context and Jewish mystical understanding. And today, he's going to be discussing Jewish mystical thought within Messianic Judaism, continuing from last week's discussion, its implications, and the readiness of MJ audiences to receive it. Welcome back, James. Good to talk to you.
Hey, guys. This has been fun.
So, James, welcome back. It's good to have you back on MJ Next for the next installment of this discussion. And we're just going to continue where we left off. So, I think that you had talked quite a bit and expanded on Jewish mystical thought from the past, from the rabbis, and how it bears on Messianic Judaism today, and its relevance to Judaism, and understanding the Bible and understanding the New Testament. Now that we've hit on that, I think before we broke off last time, you wanted to actually cite some sources to kind of just reinforce and buttress what you were saying. So I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, thank you. I think the last topic, if I recall, we left off on was Gilgul, right?
Yeah.
So I would advise anyone who's listening, if this is the first episode, I would go back and listen to part 1. And particularly the idea of Gilgul, if you're only going to invest a few minutes, because jumping in without that background could be challenging.
Yeah.
And that's what I think is the problem with a lot of this material. There's such a learning curve to the concepts and the language and the terms that all that to say, you might just want to go back and make sure you understand what we said about Gilgul. And there's a lot more to be said, but...
Yeah, because it's going to be an ice plunge if you don't.
Yeah, that's right. So... part of the concept of Gilgul, like we said, is this idea that the soul is much more complex than we've been able to understand just reading the Bible in English.
Yeah.
The Hebrew Bible has 5 levels of the soul. With that, the lowest level, nefesh, let's go back to this very briefly, is our action-oriented level. It's where it animates our body.
Yeah.
The nefesh is what helps our autonomic systems function. We breathe, we sleep, right?
The life force.
Yeah, it's a life force. It's the bodily wisdom that keeps us alive. Ruach is all of our emotional content and how we put that out into the world in an emotional sense, and the words that come through that. And the Ruach is often associated with the heart. So you'll see a lot of heart language, especially in the New Testament. Someone who's committed adultery with the heart.
Yeah.
Right? Like, what does that mean? You've recruited a certain level of the soul into that sin, which is bad. You've done some spiritual damage now, not just physical. And then the next level is neshama. Okay, that's important. Neshama is it's like the spark of who we are as a unique individual, right? And that's 3 of the 5 levels of the soul. So it's an interesting concept. we see this concept, and I want to get your opinion before I jump in. 1 John 4:13. This concept is spoken of very often in the New Testament. In fact, Christians will often say, I have Jesus in me now, or Jesus is in my soul.
Yeah.
And 1 John says, by this we know that we abide in him and he in us, because he has given us of his Spirit. Very interesting, right? Philemon 1:25. We see, may the grace of the Lord Jesus be with your spirit. Right? So we're seeing this idea of a spirit. He has a spirit and we have a spirit.
Yeah.
And may his spirit be in our spirit. Right? What does this mean? And then I have another one here.
Yeah.
So we have in 1 John again 3, he says, whoever makes a practice of sinning is of the devil, for the devil has been sinning from the beginning. The reason the Son of God appeared was to destroy the works of the devil. No one born of God makes a practice of sinning, for God's seed abides in him. And I'll stop it there because that's all we need for this. God's seed abides in him.
Yeah.
And the language there is what we would think. It's like it's reproductive language. Right? So what does this mean? These are very strange terms on there, right? If we really stop and pause and read, especially John's gospel, anything John writes is some of the most mystical Kabbalistic work in the New Testament.
Yeah.
Strangely, people see it as the most, it's the gospel to the nations. John's gospel is the gospel, right?
It is kind of funny.
It is.
But we know, like, if you try to read it and understand, I'm not going to move forward until I understand it. You're dead in the water in the first paragraph.
Oh yeah.
Because of the logos that we spoke about last time. Okay, so what does that mean? How in your words, and it's okay if it's wrong or if it's your opinion, how does someone's spirit get in your spirit, and what does that look like? How does that work? Have you ever heard this explained?
I've never
Not
heard it
really.
explained.
People have said that God dwells in us, the Messiah dwells in us, his Spirit dwells in us. I've heard that. He dwells in our hearts. Sometimes he dwells in us. Sometimes, the language around it always seems to be a little bit imprecise. And I don't think that we're always certain what we're talking about.
I would say, based on my conversations with typical Christians, it's, they'll take from the Paraclete passage in the book of John, where, I will ask the Father and he will send a helper and he will come to you, and that Spirit of God is what abides in you. I think is where most Christians would likely go with that idea.
Yeah.
Right. And I think if you're asked by a child to explain how that works, you're in trouble, because a kid doesn't foresee the theological traps of that question. They just want to know, how does that work? And I think in my experience, again, I worked in a church, I worked in a mega church, Protestant, and I spent a lot of time in the Catholic Church. There's no framework for how this works. We just sort of accept it.
We just say it and you swallow it.
And you move on.
Yeah.
And I think that there's a hazard to not understanding the technicalities, because there can be a situation where that is enabled and there's a way that that's disabled, and that's all part of this Jewish tradition. So let me give you a little background here. So the Arizal, again, Rabbi Isaac Luria comes along, and it's a great story. He finds a manuscript. Someone has a manuscript of the Zohar, and he finds this and he learns, and he's a prodigy. The guy's amazing. And he explains these concepts that have been part of the oral tradition for, over 1,000 years, we're talking, right? So he's explaining these things in a new way, almost scientifically, using new metaphors, new insights that I would say help evolve our framework of understanding Kabbalah.
Yeah.
He's not doing some brand new thing. He didn't make it up. He's explaining it in a way that audience and that audience forward can explain it for our time period.
Yeah.
Right? And I would say Messianic Judaism falls in the same trap. We don't understand these things, so we tend to also try to go backwards. We try to recreate the first century, whereas Judaism is always moving, always kind of growing, right?
Yeah.
So in the Jewish world, this is fine. The Arizal can do this. He's an amazing person. In fact, God put him here for that moment to bring light, to then help us understand these things as we move into the next phase of human existence. Make sense?
Yeah.
So he says this. Another well-known concept in the words of our rabbis, again, he's talking about the rabbis who are captured in the Talmud. It can be understood that the Spirit
the ruchot, which is the ruach, or the souls, the neshamot, which is the neshama, of righteous people, come and impregnate a person in secret. And this is called ibor. Ibor means impregnate. This helps assist him in the service of God. May his name be blessed. As it says, and he gives a midrash hanei alam, one who comes to purify himself, they can help him. And he quotes the Talmud here. So he said that our rabbis talk about this potential of a righteous person's soul coming into the soul, impregnating someone, ibor, to help them in the service of God. Right? And he goes on to say, it's possible that the actual spirit, the ruach of this righteous person, to be an ibor in a person, it can be from people who are earlier righteous people or people whose souls are in Gan Eden. Mm-hmm. So we spoke about that.
Yeah.
Gan Eden, another word for Gan Eden is paradise.
Yeah. Intermediate state, some people have said, or
the Garden of Eden.
Yeah, the spiritual. And right now we're talking about like the spiritual Garden of Eden. The same place Paul went to, we said in the last episode, the third heaven is the Garden of Eden. So you see how these, we're already pulling in a bunch of New Testament passages now in a way that we've never heard them explain.
Yeah.
Did you have a question?
No, go ahead.
So here's the interesting thing. He says, if the person completely rectifies his ruach, right? So David, we were talking about the ladder. If the person through this ibor goes up to the next level, the neshama from a righteous person will come and help them build out the next level, right? Does it make sense so far?
The neshama of a righteous person. Mm-hmm. Now, how does that work?
Right. So the righteous person has the Spirit of God in them because they've done that work to elevate their soul. They've brought so much of the presence of God into their soul that it's like a wireless charger, right? You plug it into the wall and it fills up with energy, and then you can take it and put it into a phone and you can charge that phone, right?
So are you saying then that God sends someone into your life that sort of guides you, or are you saying that the spirit of Elijah or the spirit of Moses or the spirit of I don't know, Samuel comes in and assists you? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So more or less. So what happens is in like a Hasidic meditation or prayer, you'll hear them say, please help us, our Chazal, please help us, Rabbi Akiva, please help us. They're praying for a righteous person to create a daisy chain to the Creator. Maybe a better analogy is that a righteous person, you remember those things we had at the Science Center we would go to, and you touch the electric ball, and your hair stands up, and then somebody touches your hand, and then the next person.
Their hair stands up, and it continues.
Now, picture the righteous person being the one who is touching that ball, and pretend like that ball is the Creator, that ball of energy. That current passes through to the last person. Mm-hmm. But because they're connected to that righteous person, they are part of that circuit. They're part of that connectivity to the Creator. Does it make sense?
Yeah, it's interesting because, I mean, you see in Bereshis and you see all throughout Tanakh where a righteous person atones for other people. And now the common Christian interpretation would be, well, only Jesus can atone. It's like, well, 10 people would have atoned for Sodom, had there been 10 righteous people. Those are the terms God laid out.
The Kohen Gadol.
Yeah, Kohen Gadol. We see that. So it's like, did that system just stop whereby a righteous person could atone for people, or did it continue? And of course, Christianity would just say, it was all taken out of the hands of humans and just kind of consolidated on Jesus at that point. And so the Torah goes back up into heaven, and, all this atoning is going to be done by one person. Or maybe not all Christianities think that. I know that, for example, maybe Catholicism, for example, might look to a righteous saint or something that's, what have you. And so they might be, as you said, daisy chaining onto their righteousness and following them in sort of a discipleship way. I identify, this guy's my power animal, whatever, and and so, but we see that all throughout the Bible, and I guess we're just led to believe that it just stopped. It consolidated on one man and stopped.
Yeah, like we have no ability to pay for anything beyond ourselves or impact other people's lives beyond ourselves, right? That's what kind of
like when those Christians, or I would call them Christians, God-fearers, were thrown into the Colosseums to the lions, were they atoning, in some sense, or I mean, the language in Revelation is that they're at the base of the altar as an offering of sorts. Well, wait, there's only one offering. Right.
Yeah.
So,
And there is this idea, I don't want to get too off track, but there is this idea that that's how the world operates.
Yeah.
Again, go back to our conversation about the balance of blessing and judgment, the balance of good and evil.
Yeah.
When Israel or the world contaminates the world with too much sin, judgment is brought on the world. Plagues, and we see this in our prayers.
Yeah.
If you follow the commandments I gave you, I will not bring on you the plagues and the afflictions that I brought on the people of Egypt, right?
Yeah.
So we see this in the Torah. This is a very Torah concept, not even outside of the Peshat. It's right there in the Psalms and other stories.
Sure.
So the idea is the closer we can get to taking our own sins out, becoming blameless, as Paul says, becoming perfect, like your Father is perfect, like Yeshua says, the closer we can do that on a relative scale, we then have potentially, if we reach that level, leftover merit. And in the merit of the fathers, in the merit of the patriarchs, we pray for that.
Yeah.
We say that in our Yom Kippur prayers, in the merit of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So yes, on a high level, they can bring a lot to the scale and way, more than the individual can.
Yeah.
But we can do some work too.
So, all right.
Let me wrap up with this one.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So Jesus, the soul of Messiah, is in the soul of people, apparently, according to 1 John. And this, you'll see this all over the New Testament now. So make sure you keep your eyes open for it. This idea that he's in us and we're in him, and without him, apart from him, we can't do any, right? There's this idea of soul entanglement. And then it says, okay, so the righteous person's ruach or neshama can actually traverse the veil from the upper worlds into the physical world and help us in our service of God. So somebody who's really trying, right? Somebody who repents of a sin, they have reached a level of achievement that a righteous person will say, you know what, that is legitimate repentance, and they help them. And that's what apparently the sages meant in the Talmud, according to the original. And here's the greatest part. I wanted to wrap this up with.
Sure.
If a person completely rectifies his ruach from the righteous person, the neshama will come, and it'll take the place of his own neshama. And this is what the sages say: the righteous are greater in death than during their lifetimes. So when a righteous person dies, their neshama can be divvied out to a lot more people than it could have when they were living. And when the person dies, let's say this repentant person dies, he will be able to ascend according to the level of the righteous person that the Ibor was in him. And there, in the world to come, he will be at the same height and the level of the righteous person whose soul was entangled with them.
His sponsor.
And where did we say that level of Gan Eden is?
Third.
And what's the nickname for that?
Gan Eden,
Paradise.
Paradise.
What does Yeshua say to the thief who repents on the
Today
spot?
you'll be with me
In paradise. Oh, okay. So you're saying there's a soul entanglement there.
Yeah. So
Well,
there's
let me ask you this. I mean, you're talking about, you mentioned leftover merit, and the idea that someone's leftover merit can assist us. I guess you're saying it's that part that would dwell with us. So like I could get the leftover merit of Aaron, or the leftover merit of Samuel, or the leftover merit of, to pick one of the prophets, one of the righteous men of old, Abraham, for example. But let me just play Christian advocate, if I can coin that phrase.
Sure.
Why not just ask for the leftover merit of Jesus? And I mean, because his merit would theoretically outweigh them all. And it says that it is his spirit that impregnates me, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So why wouldn't I want that spirit
above all the others.
All right. So that's what the apostles are telling the Gentile people who are coming into this movement. But you have to think of it like this. Jewish people have the patriarchs. We have the promises and the covenant given to Abraham, right? Mm-hmm. By their merit, by the covenant God struck with them, all Israel has a share of the world to come, according to the sages. Mm-hmm. And this is where we tread an entirely new topic.
Sure.
But the Gentile world at the time of the New Testament, they had no such patriarchs. As Paul said, you were far from the covenant, the commonwealth. You were dead in your transgressions. You had no hope, right? Through the tzaddik of Yeshua, they were realizing not only were they spiritually purified, they were purified enough to receive the divine presence. And that's where Paul's saying, we saw them. Peter says it, he recounts it 3 times when he saw that the divine presence had entered into the Gentiles who didn't convert. And that's what Jerusalem Council is all about.
Yeah.
He's talking, the whole argument of the Jerusalem Council turns when Peter reveals that, no, I saw them receive the divine presence just like we get. Because the rabbinic argument at that time was that there was no possible way they were going to be able to get purified enough from all that idolatry and living in the airspace in the land of the Roman Empire, which is like
cruelty,
paganic on steroids.
Yeah.
So the innovation of the New Testament is somehow, because it's never part of Yeshua's earthly mission, right? He never says, I'm here to help bring the Gentiles in. He says the opposite. He says, I'm here for the lost children of Israel. To the Canaanite woman, he says, I'm not, that's not what I'm here for, right? It's kind of a harsh passage when you read that.
Yeah.
Right.
But it's because his earthly mission was centered around 3 different things that are related to Messiah, son of Joseph. What we see after his death, somehow people who ascribe to that are becoming purified of their pagan tuma, spiritual impurity, to the point where they can now not only receive the divine presence. 1 Corinthians, Paul's talking about the different gifts that they were receiving, because he's talking to a Gentile audience. Some have the gift of chokhmah, some have understanding. Right? He's like, we got to preserve this. You guys have somehow, through Yeshua's death, been atoned for, and that's your way to the kingdom, because you don't have any other way to the kingdom. So a lot of this is really Gentile-centric, the way I read it. Does it make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I'm sitting here, having all kinds of ideas going through my head as you're talking. Like, I can understand from the perspective of the rabbis as to why they would say that Gentiles may have no connection to, no path to get to God other than through the Jewish people or through Judaism, because, in their minds, one of the things we haven't talked about is the idea that God deals directly with the children of Israel, but he has agents that oversee all the other nations. And so they're under all those other nations, which the principalities and powers that the Apostle Paul talks about. Yeah. But perhaps what was going through my mind was, well, maybe when they embrace Yeshua, they're now counted among, like the Jews, they now have a direct path to God. They're no longer under the principalities and powers, but now they're, have a direct line of communication with God, just like the Jewish people do.
Yeah, and I think that there's a nuance here which you revealed that I didn't state. So the rabbinic discussion of the generation before the destruction of the temple was the New Testament era. The discussion was not about so much the here and now. The discussion between the rabbis was, okay, it's so impure out there. Will the Gentiles have a path to the world to come? And Shammai has an opinion that's not so positive.
Yeah.
And Hillel has an opinion that's a little more positive. And there was a whole discussion about that. But both of them kind of fall down to, they kind of degrade down to, well, the ones who know God they're going to be fine. Like, they'll spend their time in Gehenna, they'll be purified, and then they'll join the world to come. What wasn't spoken about, at least not recorded that I've ever seen, was what does that mean in the here and now for Gentiles? Will they ever be able to receive the divine presence like we do in their current state? And a lot of rabbis said, no, they're too impure. They're not keeping the Noahide laws. The Noahide laws are about spiritual impurity.
Sure.
That's why, again, they're all, we said this last time, they're all prohibitions. There isn't really any of them other than the one about making systems of justice. There isn't really anything about you shall light candles or you shall keep kosher. It's really preserving them from committing sins and transgressions that bring impurity. So what they were finding in the New Testament is not only do we believe that they've been given repentance to life, as the apostles say, that means they've been given the repentance to life, as they say to Peter. What they're realizing is that just changed everything about their current life, though. We're not talking about the world to come. We're now talking about them having the Spirit tomorrow and today. What are we going to do about this? There was no precedent set for that.
Yeah.
So all of that to say, it seems as if the New Testament is speaking to these Gentiles, telling them God's seed is in you. God's seed is in you through this tzaddik who was killed. And in his merit, that's your ticket. But I don't see Paul talking to all humans that way, because of course we have the patriarchs. We have a familial connection to the Creator, right? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's a nuance, but the problem in the New Testament was not about the world to come so much. It was, what are we going to do today? Because
With all these,
they're here now,
these wild cards.
and none of the sages had really worked out what that looks like. Okay, they're Gentiles, so they're Israel now, but they're not Jews. We can't necessarily convert them. What do we expect of them?
So they're really like what I think of as, we're in the Atlanta area. So you have, inside the perimeter would essentially be Atlanta proper. Yeah. And then outside the perimeter would be greater Atlanta.
Yeah.
And so the Gentiles are like greater Atlanta. They're greater Israel. They're not really, core Israel, but they're now somehow
Commonwealth.
They're Commonwealth. They've been brought in, but they're on the fringes. They're the outer circle of people, of God's people.
They're still part of the Commonwealth. They're still part of Israel proper, because remember, Israel's job is to bring the nations back in to proper worship of God. Right? We see that in Zechariah 14. Mm-hmm. Egypt and Assyria are brought back to celebrate Sukkot. And it's dire. If they don't do it, they're in big trouble. Right?
It's a mitzvah at that point for them.
Yeah.
It's like they are, I don't want to say covenant bound, but it's like kind of, I won't bring rain. It's Deuteronomic for them.
Oh, they if they don't have rain or the Nile, then they're finished, right?
Yeah.
So, but there is this idea that the New Testament is saying that, and they weren't the only ones, by the way. They're in Eliyahu Rabbah, which is a Midrash collection, one of my favorite, from the Galilee. It says, very similar language to Paul, whether man or woman, slave or free, Jew or Gentile, all can receive the divine presence according to their deeds. Mm-hmm. And that's not from a New Testament Messianic source. That's from a traditional rabbinic Midrash.
Okay.
So
that kind of flies in the face of where I was going with my earlier thought. Paul was the only one that, at least in my mind, that really had wrestled with this idea, because you had said that we have all these Jews, these non-Jews coming in. What do we do with them in the here and now? And nobody had really given any thought to that. But the one exception would be the Apostle Paul, because he had really thought this issue through. But now it sounds like you're saying somebody else had given us some thought.
My understanding from that Midrash is it was theoretical.
Okay.
Paul is now in a halakhic sense, because he was the only one who had the halakhic authority, the training, right? Because he was from that core Judean group. Paul was probably selected partly for all the reasons people think he is. He's a Roman citizen or whatever. But I think he also had the training to make rulings on the fly.
Yeah.
But it was no longer theoretical for him.
Yeah.
And he was doing so under the auspices that we need to get them in and protect them lock them down so that they don't short circuit themselves and disconnect themselves from the Creator. And that essentially is, he's, in the Hasidic sense, we would say he's preserving the Ibor. Because once they lose that connection to the tzaddik, if you lose your connection to the tzaddik, you go back to where you were. It's like you
backslide.
Yeah, you fall back to the level you were at. You go back to like a nefesh lower level, ruach level. You don't have that same on fire awareness, right? And many ideas like this. What you'll see, there's so much more to this concept of Ibor. I encourage people to look it up. But for example, this didn't exist in writing openly until the Arizal. But then now we look back and see this makes sense of so many New Testament passages, and it makes sense of how Yeshua after death would have created this like vacuum that allowed all these Gentiles to come out of the pagan world and then receive prophecy and divine presence and things that just they were so far from on a spiritual level.
Yeah.
Because they were committing, they were eating things that were short-circuiting them, right? They were eating, drinking
blood of animals,
blood
sacrifice to idols. Yeah.
Yeah. So
all kinds
all
of
that to say
creepy
that
crawly things and
everything. They're doing just being a Roman citizen, you had to do some of those celebrations.
Yeah.
right. Yeah, it was part of your civic duty was to go and participate in the cult worship.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, James, for those sources. That's actually very fascinating. I'm seeing a lot of lineup between, I guess you'd say, the New Testament mentality on these subject matters, as well as the Jewish mystical concepts of soul and nefesh and how they coincide and how as you said they can become entangled with one another, because that's not absent in the Bible at all. We see that people do get tethered to one another in the Bible and the narratives. But I'm gonna take a little bit of a redirect here, because this isn't just this isn't mainly a theological or historical podcast, in the sense that there are plenty of Messianic Jewish podcasts out there that deal with theology and deal with history and trying to prove the Jesus is the Messiah and the Torah is not done away with. We talk about that ad nauseum. So we're going to talk actually about some issues as it pertains to life when it comes to Kabbalah, because this is an issues podcast too, and mainly an issues podcast. So just to ask you, just a personal question: how does your family and your immediate circle of believers actually receive this? I say receive with in scare quotes. How do they? I mean, garlic and crosses. Like what do they do? Pitchforks and torches, and how's this work for you?
It's funny, when you're raised in a family that's not very religious, I guess you have the luxury of not offending anybody. Yeah. Because nobody really has any sacred cows. Yeah. So I would say that maybe initially some people thought I was crazy. Yeah. But then after explaining, going through the sources, writing these things up, I think a lot of people have come to the conclusion that, wow, there's more to this than I thought. But there are still some things, and I do have some family who are more influenced by Christianity. Yeah. And there are some things that I just know not to trigger, because it doesn't do any good. And the last thing I could, and this is my general principle, I won't tear or attempt to tear pillars down unless I have time to build them back up.
That's a good rule to live by.
Right. Because you could, and I've done this, I've accidentally done this in the past. I had a study partner, we were both going deeply into topics, and I didn't recognize that he was not able to put pieces back together once we tore pillars down. Yes. And he kind of went off into a completely different path, deep end, walked away from really all biblical faith. And maybe it was inevitable, but I sort of realized in the moment, like, I was somehow able to put those together and like keep going forward. Yeah. But not everybody wants that either. Yeah. Or can. Right. And sometimes someone might be doing excellent. They might be absolutely a great person. Yeah. They don't need to look at the dynamics of these things. And again, that's why the sages would put these bans on just opening it up to everybody. Yeah. Because there is a hazard. Yeah.
So, I mean, like, there is the general hoi polloi out there. And I think we said this during the break that, if what you know is good enough for you to live a good life, to follow God, to bless the name of the Messiah and all that you do, then for you, in your specific circumstance, in this life that you've been given, that might be just enough or the right amount of truth that you need to shuttle you through this life.
Yeah.
And, I can say, like, I knew, and this is not to bash all atheists, but I knew a lot of people that in college were atheistic, and so they sort of took a perverse delight out of meeting somebody who was maybe a country girl or a naif Christian or something like that, and just shattering like everything that they believed, and it just mocking it, deriding it, shattering it, and then just kind of brushing their hands off, walking away, and not sticking around for the damage that they've done to that person. Yeah. So, and I can see, to some extent, like if there are Christians out there listening to this, we could come off as just these radical liberals that are, they're trying to kind of work within the tapestry of everything that they know, and here we are just kind of gleefully tearing away at the spool of it, so to speak, or in the fabric of it, and they're like, "What are you doing?" And so, I kind of. Not kind of. I mean, I do hew to that philosophy. So I think that there's this joke that I would always tell that, mystics and alchemists and people like that end up becoming cherubim and guarding the way, eventually. Yeah. And so, you climb to a high enough level and you see Gabriel or Michael, or you see one of the angels, and you say, "Oh yes, you're one of the mystics. You climb this mountain, breathe rarefied air. You know much and see far. We got a great job for you." Well, what's my job? Am I going to be like a great and powerful Solomonian man in the world to come? No, you're going to be a cherub, and you're going to guard the very path that you forged, and make sure hardly anybody, I say hardly, gets through, because we need more cherubs. Obviously, we never run out of need for those. But here's your flaming sword, and now you are on the other side, and you'll be the prohibitive pulling up the ladder behind you. And so there is that feeling, like I've come this far in my faith, and I go on eharmony.com, and it's like, what girl could I tell this? Yeah. Dude, what girl could I? Where do you even begin? I mean, like, this is a trip, and so you gotta have to kind of like, there's a certain a splash of water on your face of humility that you say, like, there are normal people that walk around and never think about any of this. For sure. Yeah, and are totally okay with that. So
it does. It changes the context of how you see the world.
Yeah.
And that, to me, you started to ask about what does this have to do with like everyday life. It changes the way you view the world, and it makes you different, sometimes in awkward ways.
Yeah.
Because you just look at things differently. Yeah. And you'll notice that, for instance, like I said, we were talking about the balance of good and evil. You'll see world events and say, "Oh, I know what sin must be rampant in the world for this to happen." Because the tradition teaches ultimately that this balance will be right set, whether we get on board with God's plan or not.
Yeah.
Yeshua and the sages talk about the end times are going to be full of travail.
Yeah.
And that's because sin and arrogance and ego will be completely out of control. And the only way to reset that is through trial and Gevurah, right?
Yeah.
We talk about Gevurah and Chesed.
Yeah.
And he says that, and the sages say that. And here we are in this time. And we look at our world and say, there are some big problems. And maybe not necessarily, I know we've talked about this before, maybe they're not so much physical level problems, but do we have baseless hatred? Do we have Lashon Hara?
Yeah.
Do we, like, the cognitive higher level, neshama level, ruach level problems? We're doing real damage in the spiritual world. And if we're not aware of that, then we contribute to that.
Yeah.
Right? So I think everyday life for me is weighing things through that filter. So it becomes the most important study material in my life.
Yeah.
Because I can look at, I leave the house and I left my keys. I can say, oh, that's an annoyance. Hashem just let that happen for some reason. Maybe that's atoning for something. Or I just got embarrassed. Maybe I embarrassed somebody. Right? So, and, there's a verse here. Yeshua says this too about insults, like not returning insults. But the idea is, and let me give you this verse here first. In Gates of Teshuvah, the author says, if one forgoes his right against a fellow who offended him, then in heaven they forgo all his sins. So if someone does something to you and you have the right between the laws of Lashon Hara, evil speech, you can say something back. But if you say, not going to do it, whatever, not going to take it personally, maybe he had a bad day. Instead of you bringing judgment to judgment, you erase the judgment by bringing in blessing, right? So blessing is associated with letting it slide.
Yeah.
I read 1 Peter. A couple times it says this, 3:9 and 4:14. It says, do not return evil for evil or insult for insult, but instead bless others because you were called to inherit a blessing. So we see this, the way this dynamic plays out, even in interpersonal relationships.
There's an equilibrium that's cast, and it's the job of the tzaddik or the disciple or whatever the Talmud to constantly maintain that equilibrium.
Yes.
And be mindful of that in all their actions and deeds, all their thoughts and deeds.
Yep.
So that was going to bring me to my next question about understanding Jewish Hashkafa for the last few thousand years. So this, obviously, in orthopraxy, in philosophy, and all sorts of Jewish literature and ethics, the Jewish mystical side has always presented all throughout. It's always been kind of interwoven. It's the thread is there. Continues from many years ago to today. And so, what would you say, in your judgment, is the single biggest hashkafic impact that Jewish mysticism has had on the faith itself? Because it could have just been, there are many religions that are kind of more in the here and now. Christianity might, for example, be constantly obsessed with tomorrow. Shinto religion there is no tomorrow. There's only today. Yep. And so, where do you think that mysticism? How did it change the hashkafa? The one single thing, I guess, the strongest pillar that you could think of that in terms of effect and impact.
Before you give that, let's define hashkafa for our audience, because I have a sense that some within the Messianic world don't know that term too well.
Okay. Hashkafa, it basically means your outlook or your worldview. And so, Weltanschauung, a German word.
Mishkafim comes to mind, which is the glasses that you wear.
Yeah,
modern Hebrew means glasses.
The color of lenses through which you view the world and see reality and see your role in it. Like, so for the Jewish people, for Israel, for all of Judaism, for all of time, that mystical thought has been developed within Judaism, wherever that is, and that's always debated. What would you say is the single biggest impact that's had on Jewish worldview?
It's a big question. I would say it recasts our worldview from a higher dimension.
Okay.
So if we're looking at everything with a mystical component to it, right? It's the soul of the Torah, as people have said. Then nothing you do is mundane anymore. Everything has a direct spiritual outcome or a spiritual impact. So, and I mean everything. Everything
is holy, and everything has an infinite stake wrapped up in it.
Every prayer you say, every psalm you sing, every piece of trash you pick up, we use that example. Every challenge you face, right? You realize this challenge I'm not a victim of this challenge. This is given to me to shape me into who I need to be.
Yeah.
This is going to teach me patience. This is going to teach me how to be a more sensitive person.
Yeah.
I've observed this. I've observed people. I'm going to go too far off track.
That's fine. Go off track.
I've watched people who, in my earlier days when I wasn't very religious, I knew people who I might call a womanizer. And God gave them a daughter. And only daughters.
Yeah.
And through that, they became a much more sensitive soul around their relationship. It causes them to
Reassess.
evaluate their relationship. And this is, at the end of the day, all of us have our own tikkun, our own tikkunim. We have our own journey, mission, struggle, our own challenges. So the mystical approach has become, has remained vital because it's always been about that. We failed when humanity failed when we took an overly rational worldview and only sought to count that which can be measured and physically held and tangible. And even like the religious Jewish rationalistic movement.
The Spinozas.
Yeah, but even someone like Maimonides, great sage, right?
Yeah.
He said later in life, this is powerful, because everyone knew he didn't have access to that tradition somehow. He had never come across the tradition, but he did learn it later in life. And he's recorded as having said, had I known this tradition earlier, I would have retracted some of what I said. Because people look to him and say, oh, he's a rationalist. He's the only way to look forward. But for him to admit that there's a whole world of this that I haven't really considered, and now that I get it, it pulls the drain out a little bit. Right? So now, but I think if we're doing it to try to channel angels and demons, I'm not being facetious, but like I said, if people think it's all about
leveraging,
witchcraft, then I think that's a tool of the Yetzer Hara to keep us away from probably what is the most powerful tool for our spiritual elevation, for us to become more sensitive spiritual people, for us to see the value in why do I separate meat and dairy, right? On the physical level, you can't make sense of that.
Yeah, it's like you're just kicking rocks around. It's like these little acts in isolation, and so
right. But if there is a spiritual coin that goes up for these little things, and it goes to the greater good, and it balances that scale of good and evil, everything you do is important. And that's what the sages say. Everyone who does one good mitzvah tips the scale of the world to good.
Yeah.
And every sin, the opposite.
Yeah.
It sounds in some ways like you're saying that the one aspect that mysticism brings or sheds to our hashkafa is that it makes us more responsible on a cosmic level.
Yes.
To be mindful of the impact that our actions have in the spiritual realm and upon others. And we have to, I love the Hebrew word for responsibility. It's achariyut, which relates to the Hebrew word other, acher. So you have to, when you're responsible, you have to be thinking about not just yourself, but mostly about others. And it sounds like a lot of what you're saying relates to that idea of us being responsible to others.
That's beautiful. And, so that is the essence of it, because all Israel are one.
Yeah.
And we're all connected, all humanity.
Yeah.
So there's something that happened recently after this horrible event, right, in Israel.
In Israel, yeah.
The young girls, there's a movement happening on TikTok. I don't know if you've seen this. They're cutting up their immodest clothing because Israeli culture is secular, for the most part, right?
Yeah.
Right.
It's secular, and a lot of the people are. I mean, some places like Tel Aviv might as well be any city in America.
Yeah.
Right? There's some things that happen.
It reminds me of being in Miami when I go to Tel Aviv.
Yeah, very, very close to South Beach, right? But these young girls started going on TikTok and cutting up their clothes.
Their skimpy outfits.
Yeah, and they were cutting them up and throwing them in a pile, and they're getting rid of them, and they're doing whatever they do, but they're ruining them. They're not wearing them again. And it's for the safety of the soldiers who are going into war. Where, like on a physical level, if you're reading Torah on the Peshat, that doesn't make any sense. There is no connection between them cutting their clothes up and people's safety in war. But if you look at the Bible's example,
Deuteronomy,
the way there are spiritual preparations that we do in the physical world, we're bringing that wisdom, that light down into the physical world, and it has an impact all the way back up.
And real world outcomes here. Like you'll defeat your enemies if you're right. We see that somewhat in the Deuteronomic equation of this for that. But in the Jewish mystical sense, it's sort of on the, I keep on using this term, behind the curtain, showing how it's exhibiting a way that all that could be tethered together. Yeah,
Yeah, and it's very powerful.
Yeah.
And these young girls, somehow they got the idea, and they did it. And that will have effect, right? We know we can read Psalms for people. We say prayers for people who already passed.
Mm-hmm.
So not only can we help the world around us, we can help souls that are no longer in the time and space continuum that we're in.
Yeah.
Souls that have traversed that, right? Our prayers are about that.
Yeah.
Yom Kippur prayers go back for the whole year. So we're not even bound by time and space, but we're so used to thinking in the rational world, the physical, tangible.
You know, that reminds me of, and I brought this up, is the parable of the unforgiving servant. You know,
Yeah.
he owes like what, 600,000, I forget the exact number, to some, he's like a viceroy, vice regent, and he owes basically millions to this king, and the king is getting ready to sell his family into slavery and put him into debtor's prison, and he asks for forgiveness, and the king grants him plenary forgiveness, plenary absolution for all this debt. And then he, of course, he goes down and shakes down that other kind of I don't know, this kind of poor little guy, he owes like 100 denarii or something like that, chump change. And
$20.
$20, yeah. And so, but what's interesting is about, if we see that as, destinies and judgment and this life and next life and however that shakes out, debtors' prisons, the way they worked is friends and family could come and redeem that person, or at least dedicate money to the fund that would eventually redeem that person. And it's like, well, that is praying for somebody that may be passed, and you are conveying that sentiment and that connection to God, that this person meant something to me, and I always want to have their memory before you, and so we light the Yizkor candle and we do those things. But yeah, so I mean, like it's there. We did talk extensively about the Messiah, the Trinity, the nature of Messiah, and we treaded on some controversial ground, but that's part and parcel with this podcast. And so, because of that, some people listening might be rankled. And again, we want to say that even amongst this table, not all of our beliefs here are completely uniform. And whatever you believe, we know that God loves you, and we honor you and treat you with respect. And we assume that you're acting in good faith when you explore these questions from your standpoint, and assume always that we're doing the same. Mm. So now, to pivot on that, what do you think MJ's overall posture towards Jewish mystical and esoteric tradition actually is? Because, I don't imagine everybody's on board with this.
No, I think it's changing.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah.
I've had conversations with Daniel Lancaster.
Oh,
FFOZ.
Nice guy.
Yeah, great, and I'm thankful he's taken the time, shared ideas, and said, "Hey, what are your thoughts on this?" And we've shared ideas about the movement in general. And look, I think the UMJC is who we report into.
Yeah.
Those leaders really made a huge step coming out of the context they were in, right? Like the creation, and even go back before them, creating Messianic Judaism out of the church was a massive step.
Yeah.
But the next generation of the baton pass has to be, okay, good, Jesus is Jewish. We're okay with that.
The Torah is still relevant.
Right. Now what do we do with the rabbinic tradition? Do we accept the oral tradition or not? And I think a lot of Messianic Judaism, as I've been told in those earlier years, have said no, like we don't need that.
And that would still be the case with most Messianic congregations today.
Sadly. And I think, even things like where does the Bible say anything about a synagogue? Where does it say anything about the services? How do you keep Passover?
But
right?
they'll do that.
They'll do it, but you're digging. Where are you coming up with those traditions?
Selectively, yeah.
Selective, yeah. But if we either take the academic view and continually put a flag in the ground every time we make a new change, or we anchor back, like the Jewish world does, we anchor back to that core set of wisdom, the two Torahs, as it said, the Torahs were given to Moses, and the tradition says it was the written and the oral. And for a long time, it was just the oral, right? So at what point do we draw the line? So I think Messianic Judaism has to wrestle with how much of the rabbinic tradition, and I have an opinion on that, but I'm not a leader in UMGC. It has to right set itself with the rabbinic tradition, because I think the New Testament happened before the Mishnah was codified. I think if that little bit of time, if let's say the time Yeshua and the apostles came was post Mishnah, I don't think we would even have this discussion today. Judaism would have evolved and moved in accordance with its own, right? Because at that point they were all about unity.
Yeah.
It was so sectarian in that 1 century that they fixed it largely around the time of the Mishnah.
Yeah.
And then everything went forward, and Judaism weaves and bobs the challenges of life in every region, and it's living and breathing.
Sure.
But because of that vacuum of leadership, of information, when opinions were creating fractures, it somehow made it out to the nations, and the nations have somehow brought it back down to all parts of the world, and now Messianic Judaism is popping up. So divine providence made it go that way. But I think Messianic Judaism has to then take a look back and say, we owe it to ourselves to explore the rabbinic tradition.
Yeah.
Because if you're doing it without, it's going to die.
Yeah.
Or it's going to fracture.
Yeah.
It's already fractured.
Yeah.
Then the next phase of that, which is part of this, is, okay, I'm seeing a lot of rabbinic mysticism in this, and Midrash. The other book I wrote, Into the Orchard, the Midrashic tradition, I would actually tell people to start there because it starts with the Midrash.
Sure.
There's a lot of Midrash that Yeshua calls on. So if you don't know the Midrash, you might walk away from his parable with the complete opposite meaning from what he said.
Yeah.
But I think in time we'll get there.
Yeah.
But when you open that door to the rabbinic tradition, like you said, that thread of mysticism is pervasive. It's there.
It's undeniable.
And then you'll see again, oh wow, these guys were not only Jewish, they were really Jewish. They were deep into this material.
Yeah.
And really, if you think about it, if we're saying that Jesus was a Peshat level rabbi, he's just walking around teaching the Peshat level,
Yeah.
that's not impressive.
No.
They
No,
had that. They
not
had
at
deeper, right?
Yeah.
So if we're saying that he was just a Peshat level teacher, he's just teaching things at the plain and simple level,
Yeah.
the literal level, then we're just doing a disservice to his teaching and his whole style of teaching and his apostles, because they too were very learned. So at some point, and this I think is the last step. I think when we do this, we will have the tools to cashier Messianic Judaism,
Yeah.
and the Jewish world will no longer have a real problem. We're not pushing these dangerous anti-Torah ideas.
Shatuff ideologies, yeah.
Yeah, then we're back into, like we were talking about before, there's really nothing wrong with that. Let's pray together.
Yeah.
And then we've united on a level that hasn't happened yet, and I think it'll come. But I think the rabbinic doorway is the gate to that next level, and you'll see it. Okay, I'll keep Shabbat, but I'm stopping at this time, or I'll keep kosher, biblical kosher, but I'm not going to worry about dairy, right?
Yeah.
So we see that. The reality is, at some point, we need to look at that whole rabbinic tradition, understand it,
Yeah.
and not create our own.
Better say you're a bad Jew than say that there are no rabbis and they have no authority. Better admit that you're bad at it and you can't do it that well, and it's really hard, and I'm trying, but this is as far as I can take it. Better to do that than say there isn't a standard. So I find that, we just said it earlier about selectivity. Like FFOZ, for example, does a really good job of, I think, introducing people to certain mystical thought, like in Shadows of the Messiah in their series, and sometimes they'll quote some things like the Pasik Hadta and various other intensely mystical texts and use them as examples of Jewish messianism. As a broad concept, but then again, do you see that? And I see it too, that people from an evangelical stripe within this movement love esotericism very selectively. Is that good enough or what?
Give me an example.
I don't know. Like they might be totally wowed by something in Jewish literature that's like a parallel to Yeshua or something, but then at the same time, something else in Jewish literature that's like, well, meat and dairy. There's a reason for this, or some mystical reason. No, this is crap. I don't want to deal with this. This is is it going back to what we said earlier? Is it good enough?
I think Hashem has all of us on our own journey, right?
Yeah.
And I think the beauty of the New Testament is that it's not wrong. Now, there have been misinterpretations of it, but take a look at the Sermon on the Mount.
Yes.
Arguably the most popular piece of literature in the New Testament, right?
In world history.
Gandhi loved it.
Yeah.
He was like, these teachings endeared Jesus to me, right?
Yeah.
Universal. There is so much Kabbalah in that, in those words, that if you know the metaphors and you know his language, and if you read those chapters, you're seeing concealed Kabbalah. You're seeing, and this is what teachers did. We said this in part one. Yeshua would speak in parables. A good rabbi, a good mystic, is able to take that material and conceal it so that people who know at that level, and then the masses, can take the simple version of it and apply it. So I think that you don't have to know it to know the basics, but I do think you will be stunted from understanding the dynamics. Yeah. But the last thing about the New Testament leaves a lot out because there's a lot of institutional knowledge that was already part and parcel to a community. Right? They don't take time to explain how to light candles and when to light candles. It's not very halakhic. Yeah. So you will understand Musar level ethics of how to be a good person, but you won't understand the dynamics of the true depth of it and maybe some of the more practical everyday stuff, because the New Testament as a Jew does not help me know how to live out real life problems today in a practical halakhic sense. Yeah. I have to go back to the sages because the Messianic world hasn't produced that. Yeah. Right. So
it's tragic.
Yeah. So you can look at the basic ideas and not know the Kabbalah and still be an excellent person and become someone people will love, but you don't have to know those higher levels.
Yeah. So I like what you said, that there's a way that teachers can sort of speak to two audiences at one time and sort of lozenge a very profound message in what looks like a very simple basket. So I think the Russian word for that, it was samizdat. Back during the time of the revolution, that was underground literature or forbidden literature. And so like when you read the book of Esther, it's written, God's nowhere mentioned in it, but so a pagan reading it just thinks it's kind of like a sordid tale of the king's debacle and all these, this Jewish woman, and the Jew reading it sees God in every page, and it was geniusly written to be that samizdat. There's so much concealment within Judaism that only certain onlookers can receive. Again, that flies so much in the face of just the evangelist that just wants to tell everybody everything all at once and proclaim it from the rooftops. So
because it's easier if you just, like David said, what's the right answer? You just learn the right answer and you move on to the next one.
The next right answer.
There's no challenge.
Yeah, exactly.
There's nothing that you gain as you mature. So as you know, in Esther, God's name is written in the Hebrew. It's concealed. Yeah, and it's written into the text in the Ratius. It's in the first letters of words and letters.
Acrostics. And,
and Sephirot are mentioned. And a lot of New Testament references come from Esther. Yeah. Right? So it's like, but you don't need to know all of that. Yeah. But just know that you're reading it at a limited level. There's a lot more to it than that.
Yeah. Half my kingdom for a dance.
Right. The queen came to the king. Like these are very deep.
Yeah. So I mean, like, now here's another question. This is a philosophical question. I've always felt that, like, when my ex, she would always catch me reading, I could be reading Ovid or Plutarch or whatever. A lot of Greek classics. You know me for that. And I could say, for example, I could tell her the story of Remus and Romulus. The two founders of the one founder of Rome who killed his brother. It's kind of a Cain and Abel, kinslaying sort of founding murder story.
Slave the king.
Yeah, and so the underpinning of it is that you do everything you can for the glory of Rome, and even family. It comes even before family. The dutiful call of a dutiful Roman is to put the glory of Rome paramount, even above fellow family members, and so that became sort of the cradle song that built an empire. Plato said very extensively that it's the stories we read or tell our children growing up. When he started the Republic, he didn't start with the walls or the polis or the constitution or the composition of the army. He started with the stories that we would tell our kids. So I explained to my ex that had really real outcomes in life, the stories. And so, if you judge a dream, a myth, a story, and you say, okay, well, it's a wispy, airy thing. It's evasive to us. It's elusive to us. And we are the real things in this world. But really, after you and I and everybody, we're all dead and nobody remembers our name, Remus and Romulus will still be quarreling in that field and, near the Capitoline Hill, right? And so if you judge what is real by what stands, Remus and Romulus are more real than you and I to some extent. And so, to some extent, there is a certain usefulness and power to belief that regardless, of the content of it, it's going to have an outcome in the real world. So then I segue to this question from a philosophical standpoint: Is Kabbalah useful to the degree? Is Kabbalah useful to the degree that whether it is a fact or not, it offers useful truth to live by? Like Dr. Faust isn't a fact, but he's true. So something is profound in the story of Johann Goethe's Dr. Faust. So do you see it as a useful myth, or do you see it as true in the sense that maybe an evangelical would ask when he's trying to really pin you down, and do you believe this? There's not a right or wrong answer. I'm just giving you free rein.
Yeah, I think that these stories are powerful because they can be taught at different levels.
Yeah.
You can teach kids. Like I told you, we spoke about Gilgul.
Mm-hmm.
My Orthodox friend said, we learned that as kids. So as a kid, they learned about how the soul has a kind of life, a journey of its own.
Yes.
That is transcending everything we're doing in our physical life. Is it literal? I mean, what's literal? What's real and literal?
Yeah.
Right. The Torah, as the sages say.
That's another loaded word. Yeah.
Yeah. The Torah. The sages say the Torah is written in the words of man. That basically we can just start somewhere.
Yeah.
Because we're in this occluded reality. We're in the world of Asiya, the lower level.
Yeah.
We're the furthest from the Creator in that sense. But we couldn't comprehend. I was reading Michio Kaku's book, Inner Space, theoretical physicist.
Yeah.
And he was talking about we have no tools, no cognitive tools to understand the fifth dimension, which is interesting too, because science has said that our reality fell from 10 dimensions, right, to the 4 that we're in.
Prolapsed, yeah.
Which is like we're 4 or 5, depending on how they are.
Oh, wow. So
yeah. 10 dimensions fell to 4 or 5, depending on which school of thought you.
Oh, wow.
Right. So again, science is coming back. But what he said was, we don't have the ability to understand what the fifth dimension even looks like. So all of our models, which are a dimension down from that, are finite. They're locked into time.
Yeah.
Because that next dimension is outside of time and space, right? Like you would see every movement that I've made squirming in this chair while we're talking, all at the same time outside of time and space.
Yeah.
So I think that you have to start somewhere. And the Torah, as the sages wisely said, there are concealed truths in there, but it's written in a language that you can take it to some extent, but you can't really take it literal because we have no idea what these look like.
Yeah.
But these frameworks of what we're telling you are valuable.
Yeah.
And I think that's how I look at it.
Sure.
So do we have a multifaceted soul? I think so.
Yes.
Do we have different parts of us that are at war with different parts of us? Like
Yeah.
my
Sub-personalities. Yeah.
yeah, my intellectual self, my emotional self, and my physical self. Like sometimes Paul says that, like I do the things I don't want to do. And
I don't know why.
yeah, I think that's that's a beautifully written, encapsulates the struggle. But I think that if taking them literally, for some people, some parts of it literally helps you get to the level where you can see it more holistically, then great. But of course, the hazard is when you, the Kabbalists say this, when you take things too literally,
You turn it to an idol.
yeah. And I think that all these can be very useful tools to help us elevate. But we have to be kind of checked in with ourselves to know where and when we engage at that level. But I think, yeah, they're powerful. I mean, they, like you said, the stories live on.
Yeah, they do.
A lot of times it's these Hasidic stories that I can tell my kids, and they grasp a principle 5 times quicker than if I read the passage out of the Bible.
Yeah.
They remember the story. For some reason, our brains are hardwired to remember stories. And I'll tell the story to someone else, and I know this story. It's like, great, but they do, it stuck. One try, and it stuck.
Yeah.
So I think that the tradition has figured that out early on.
So it has avoided ossifying into, just rank literalism, but at the same time, leaving the door open.
Yes,
Yeah.
but I think that's a very different, and I will say this, I think that's a very different way to approach Scripture than we were taught in any version of Christianity we came from.
Yeah.
We bring that thinking, that literal, did this literally happen? Is this historical? We bring that kind of like judgment into the Jewish world. And we don't immerse ourselves in the tapestry of Jewish thought.
Yeah.
We bring that old way of thinking into Judaism,
Yeah.
and we kind of wreck parts of it.
Nice.
We wreck the ability to where there have been, my first time I ever did a teaching back in Maryland, I brought in a Midrash and 2 people left. So like,
Oh
right?
my gosh.
Like, because they had
You are a
not,
pilgrim in an unholy land,
Yeah.
to quote Indiana Jones.
and I went to the rabbi and said, hey, is that because of the Midrash I brought in? He said, yeah, that was a long time coming. But anyway, like, we bring the wrong type of thinking.
He
because,
listened to Pickle Jar.
Yeah.
Well, that leads me to, I guess, one of the next questions we have, and that is, what do you feel is Messianic Judaism's posture towards what you have to say regarding mysticism and Kabbalah?
Well, I would actually let me come in there and just kind of qualify. I mean, not qualify that, but just add to that.
Sure, expand on it.
Yeah, expand on that. We're not, just those of you who are listening, we're not talking to just somebody who's an idle pedant when it comes to studying. He actually does give teachings up in front of an audience. And so, like any comedian, he's probably geared to read a crowd at this point and can know when the coughs are starting to, and the room is getting smaller and quieter and people are looking around with darting glances, searching the eyes of others for what they should think about what he's saying.
Well, if they get up and walk out and leave.
Yeah. So, like, we did ask about Messianic Judaism, but I just kind of want to know, without mentioning any congregations in specific, give us some, I guess, some more stories, if you will, of your experiences.
Yeah. So, I mean, for sure, there is a threshold of ideas that you can bring. We've already stepped way over the line in our time in these 2 episodes. Because the problem is you have to unpack a lot, and you have to disarm preconceived notions, sola scriptura. Protestantism has that sola scriptura, the remnants of it.
Yeah.
And Catholicism is almost its own genetic entity.
Yeah. I mean, they have their own tales of their saints and things like that.
So I'll give you a story. So I did some work on Ancestry.com, and we found some relatives who are still out there from our family who were Jewish. And one of them is a little older than my mom, and he connected with me on my email And I said, oh, great. So you're Eva's son. You're Jewish. He said, well, I can't be Jewish. I'm Catholic. Right. So, and I like, here we are on Ancestry.com, and now I'm trying to explain to him.
Halakhically, you are Jewish.
Right. But so there are definite, when you're treading into territory that will bring a fight.
Yeah.
And you're pleasantly surprised when it doesn't.
Yeah.
But I think at the end of the day, my goal is to try to make it practical.
Yeah.
But my in a dream world, and this goes back to DJing, every DJ has like the 10 songs that they're super excited about that just came out yesterday.
10 is a charmed number with you, isn't it?
Oh yeah, I didn't realize. Or like, call it one song. You just got it yesterday. No one's heard this song yet. Everyone at the club's going to love it.
Yeah.
And they're not, because they've never heard this song.
Yeah.
And the more alcohol they have and the more comfortable they are, like the further back you go.
Yeah.
So you're playing the same 50 songs that you've been playing all of your life that you grew up, right?
Yeah.
Because that's their comfort zone.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody wants to hear about that other thing outside the comfort zone. It's not relative. It's not, I don't have any familiarity with it.
Yeah.
So my goal would be to bring these ideas to help people see the New Testament in its depth. Because I do believe there's an untapped depth to the New Testament. But for sure, you have to kind of know your audience. And that's why, before coming on, I asked, what are your boundaries? Because I know, like, you trigger them, and then you can lose people, and then you don't have the conversation anymore because you're.
Yeah,
well,
I guess this conversation is going to maybe. I don't know yet how much we're going to put out there or how we're going to edit it, but there's probably going to be a director's cut. I don't know. Maybe we'll just throw it all out there and say accept it as you may, and come hell or water high,
we'll have a members only for the want to hear the entire the conversation in its entirety.
So just those of you unfamiliar, I mean, you can't see really expressions and faces in a podcast, but our friend James here, he has a certain kind of gallant stoicism about him. He carries himself, he lives out his Jewish ethics, and so like, when there's a bit of a machlokas, a tiff, we'll say, between an audience member and James, and we've seen this before, he's very well composed, and he is the matador, is swiftly, swishing his Veronicas around the bull, and he always keeps as cool as a cucumber, and he's always very polite, and so
right, because we've seen some of that pushback or some of the uncomfortability among audience members here, even in our own congregation.
Sure. We consider ourselves a congregation that's pretty well far ahead of others in terms of its openness to more traditional Jewish ideas. And so, you're really a frontiersman, and that's a hat tip to you. But that's probably the space that you occupy to a lot of people, and that's totally okay. Everybody needs them, we're starting to wrap up now. And so, again, you mentioned this on the previous installment, but what are some resources that you recommend if somebody wants to start? Because looking at the pleroma, the spiritual ambit of everything that could be under the Jewish mystical umbrella. That's vast. Where does somebody who's an MJ start?
Yeah, I guess it depends on what interests you. So again, I'll plug the site, my website, thehiddenorchard.com,
sure,
because I do have a wide range of categories. So some people might be more interested in spiritual development. Mm-hmm. Like, I just want to be a better person. I don't care about the technical structure of how the universe, I don't care how many angel classes there are, or demons. I'm not interested. What can I do? Yeah. So then I would look at books like Chafetz Chaim's book on Lashon Hara, or Duties of the Heart, right? Duties of the Heart is a small 2-volume, if you get the 2-volume set. Small book teaches you a lot about worldview and how you can start to become a better person and view God. Because I will say that before you go anyone goes jumping into mysticism, you might want to spend some time kind of reframing some of the core pillars of Torah faith. Yeah. God is very different in Judaism than the God of the church. Yeah. Right? God is, there's a oneness, but there's also somewhat of a way that he interacts with the multiple. Yeah. And that's a very challenging concept. We've tried to do that here before. We've tried to do Ramchal's Way of God.
Yeah.
And it crashed and burned because the topics in the first chapter, which were just getting started, were just too much for some people in the group.
Yeah.
But I would spend time reading that book. Or, if someone says, okay, well, I already got that. I'm already into the rabbinic tradition. I read on Sefaria.org. There's another one. You can go and see some of these commentaries. I read Rashi. I know what Ramban says. Ramban's kind of the Kabbalistic commentary. Then I would say that there are Jewish Learning Institute has good material.
Sure.
Chabad has good material. Chabad is another opinion, though. They're another type of Hasidic Judaism. They're not the only people out there.
Yeah.
I think Breslev is probably the most synchronized to the New Testament teachings.
Yeah.
So I would say Breslev Institute is another place to look. Great teachings there. And then, if you're still not finding what you want, there's a rabbi one of my favorites, Rabbi Dovber Pinson, last name Pinson, and he does an amazing job. He has great books. He writes eloquently. He has a real gift for taking concepts and making them simple and relevant. And he has all the knowledge to back it up and the sources if anyone has a problem with it. Because I find that too. People want to know, sources. Where are the sources for this?
Yeah.
Some of the books you mentioned fall into a category I would label as Musar.
Yeah.
So do you see Musar as, and Musar, by the way, is just a Hebrew word that means discipline.
Discipline, yeah.
But more so like the discipline you would receive from a coach, that type of discipline, not something that's harsh.
Yeah, it's a really good question.
But do you see it? I mean, do you see Musar as a type of
Mystical
Kabbalistic, mystical?
It's veiled. Yeah, I wanted to say it earlier when we were talking. We were close to that topic. So yeah, people think that when people like the Vilna Gaon or his students had a problem with the Musar movement, it wasn't because Musar is whatever area of the Jewish landscape it's focused on. It was because it was creating a distraction from other Torah study.
Yeah.
But Musar and Kabbalah go hand to hand.
Yeah.
And in fact, even Rabbi Salanter, he was aware of the Zohar, and he knew the Zohar.
Rabbi Salanter being the modern-day
Musar.
founder of the Musar movement, I
Yeah.
would say.
The late Musar movement. So even like Yeshua's words, when he's teaching you about how to treat other people, he's teaching you on a level that's engaging higher levels of the soul. But he's doing it for the masses in a way that you can become a better person. Like you can drive the car without knowing how to build the car.
Yeah.
Right? You can use this tool without having to understand where it was manufactured and how, and
Sure.
powdered metal and rubber overmolds, right? Like you can use this and you'll get the same outcome in the long run.
Yeah.
But that's for everybody, by the way. But I think Musar becomes more powerful when you realize what you're doing. Oh, I know why
Yeah.
Yeshua said calling somebody a fool sends me to Gehenna.
Yeah.
Right? We talked about that in one of our teachings here. How does calling somebody a fool put you in this place called Gehenna? What's the connection there? There's no connection in the physical world because speech is an abuse of a higher level faculty that only humans have.
Yeah.
Right? So I think Musar is great. It gets you started. It helps you develop, start to climb the ladder of that soul. But when you combine it with higher level knowledge, then it's off to a whole new trajectory.
Sure.
But I would say most people start there. Start with the book on Lashon Hara. That's probably the biggest one. And I think that will do something for you spiritually that will start to make your path. You'll start to learn sources. He just quoted the Zohar on that. He just quoted, right, the Alter Rebbe or whatever, whoever he's quoting. And then you'll start to find in these books other books you might want to.
So Lashon Hara is the one you would recommend starting with. That's Rabbi the Chavetz Chaim's book. And Lashon Hara, for the benefit of our audience, means evil speech or the type of talk we shouldn't be having come out of our lips.
The things that are totally permitted in modern culture today.
Yeah.
Yes, the things, but which are forbidden
To us.
to us as students of the Messiah and of Scripture.
Yeah, James talks about it, right? He's talking about the effects of speaking, and he even talks about the fire of the tongue. He's using very mystical language, but he's teaching his audience the practical application of it, because he just wants them to get started on it.
Yeah.
These Gentiles who are coming in, they don't need to know the full. Kabbalah is like the quantum mathematics. How it's applied in science is Hasidus.
Yeah.
So you can do both, but start with what's more practical to you.
You know, I think it's interesting. Heschel said that Judaism is a science of deeds. This is how he characterized it. So tell our audience again about your site and your the books you've authored, and give them just something to nibble on as we close.
Yeah, and where we can buy those books.
Yeah, thank you. So the website is thehiddenorchard.com, and I have a whole wide range of concepts. Again, I said this in the first episode, I believe. A lot of the content that I put out there is to fight anti-Semitism and replacement theology, because I think those are two massive barriers for Jewish and Christian conversation.
You're clearing the way, so to speak, for deeper things.
Yeah, because a lot of Jews see the New Testament as an anti-Semitic book, because that's what they've been taught.
Yeah.
That's how it's been practically interpreted in some cases. So a lot of that stuff is free. You can subscribe with an email, and you'll get more Musar, teaching, some things that we've done here at Tikvat are on there as well. Okay. And then if you want more of this Kabbalistic kind of view, if you're ready for that level, there's another level that you can pay into for a year. Amazon is where I have the books. They're self-published, just because I wanted to get the ideas out. Sure. And if you're interested, there's a book that I started first, which is called Into the Orchard, the Midrashic Tradition of the New Testament. And I would say this is for people starting in this space.
Yeah.
If you want to know what types of Pharisees are there, the Pharisees aren't the bad guys, okay? No. There are two types of Pharisees. That type of material is in there, along with Midrash histories that I think are directly referenced or related to the New Testament. Because a lot of times, pretty much everything in the Sermon on the Mount, we spoke about that earlier, has a parallel in the Talmud or the Midrash. Yeah. Some of the stories told in the Gospels are a Midrash.
Right? I think actually in Tolstoy there's a discussion. I think it's Tolstoy, one Russian author, in which somebody is talking to a Jewish man about the Sermon on the Mount, and at every turn the old Jewish man is saying, "Yeah, that's in the Talmud. That's in the Talmud. That's also in the Talmud." And so Tolstoy was probably, I guess, in on something that Mark Twain was in on as well. And
yeah, but I think if you see the tradition, then you have two stories that are similar, and you can make sense of them through the other, right? It's another leg to stand on. And then, sorry, the last book I just put out is more of this mystical component. Mm-hmm. We look at the levels of the soul, what they look like, how they manifest in our life, and how we can optimize them. And I use a lot of the tradition for that as well. Sure. But that's the second one. I would do if you're just starting off, I would start off with the Midrash one.
Sure. Okay. All right. Well, I think I speak for my co-host here, David, in saying that, James, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on. The delight is all on this side of the table.
Indeed.
There's such a mother lode here of discussion, and just both profound and engaging. And so we are at Tikvat very lucky to have you, and we are very privileged to have you join us this evening. So
pleasure's mine. Thank you for the time.
All right. Cheers. Yeah, you can always rely on James to provide some excellent, thought-provoking content. So anyway, we're getting to that part of the show that everybody anticipates.
Yes, indeed.
It's the pinata portion. And take a whack at something. So anyway, for our next segment and final segment of today's episode, the Messianic Wall of Weird.
All right.
Take it away, David.
Well, for this podcast episode, I wanted to talk a little bit about some groups that recognize the beginning of a Jewish month.
Yeah.
You know, the halakha in Judaism says that the month is to be, the beginning of the month is we mark the beginning of a month, and then from there we can count the number of days until a holiday that might be falling within that month, such as Passover or Yom Kippur or the Feast of Tabernacles, Shavuot. I mean, sorry, not Shavuot, Sukkot.
Yeah. So it's important to note that for those of you listening, that the Hebrew calendar is not like the modern Gregorian calendar. The modern Gregorian calendar is a solar calendar. It follows the solar cycles, the behaviors of the sun, and so lunar calendars typically go by, and they're punctuated by the months, and that's for example, one of the features of the lunar calendar is that a day begins at sunset as opposed to midnight.
Correct.
So it was evening and it was morning the first day. It's not morning and evening the first day like it would be in a Western calendar.
And you mentioned the word lunar.
Yeah.
So let's make a distinction. The Hebrew or biblical calendar is a lunar calendar, not a solar calendar.
And so it's the moon goes through phases where it wanes and waxes, gets tiny to a sliver, like almost a fingernail in the sky, and then it'll start to grow again to become a full moon, and then go the opposite way again. So it I guess peaks and crests and comes back down, and just like a wave, and it does that many times in a year, creating what in the Hebrew calendar are the months. From Adar and Tammuz and all the other months that we have, Tishrei, all the way to so it explains pretty much all of Jewish life, and it's how we calculate the feasts, how we calculate everything. And Shabbos is actually independent of it. Shabbos goes
correct.
Regardless, Shabbos is the one thing that doesn't really hinge on the sun or the moon.
Right, it's its own thing.
And so
it's every 7 days, regardless of when the beginning of the month or the beginning of the year happened to be.
So we wouldn't necessarily use the moon to calculate the Shabbos, but pretty much everything else is dependent upon that. And so we have a Jewish calendar, and we have a good Jewish calendar. And you can go to Chabad, for example, and they have all the you can enter your zip code. You can find what the candle lighting time is. You can know when the next feast is going to be, if Passover is coming around the corner, what date, what time you have to light the candles, etc. And it's all built around. It's all calibrated around the moon and all of its moods, we'll say, in the sky. So this particular group of people that you're talking about in today's Messianic wall of weird, they just don't believe the Hebrew calendar.
Well, let's talk a little bit about how the Hebrew calendar came about.
Sure, go ahead.
It was prior to the destruction of the temple. Mm-hmm. The moon was the beginning of the month began when the moon renewed its cycle. Yeah. So the moon, after it's full, it immediately the next day begins to wane, meaning it's a little bit less of a pie in the sky than each succeeding night until you finally get to what we think of as a new moon, where the moon is in at least
starting to grow
again. Well, from a scientific perspective, an astronomical perspective, a new moon, I believe, means no moon. It's just completely hidden. Yeah. And then the moon begins to appear again, a teeny tiny sliver of it. That biblically is the new moon. And I believe it appears typically at the crack of dawnish, thereabouts, when the cycle begins again. And so someone had to
in the ancient times.
Someone had to see it
in the ancient times.
And you would know it was one of 2 days it was going to be on.
Yeah.
Because you could tell by the moon is waning down, because in a lunar cycle, the month is 29 and a half days long. So one month, the length of the month will be 29 days. The next month it'll be 30 days. So sometimes it might be, 29 days, 2 months in a row, or 30 days, 2 months in a row. But typically it's going to be 29 days followed by 30 days.
Yeah.
And you would have, so if you didn't have a witness and you had to have two witnesses, because facts are determined by two witnesses. So you'd have to have two reputable witnesses that were known to be able to, who were trustworthy. And when they say they saw the new moon, you knew you trusted they knew what they were talking about, and not just making something up. And so when you had two of these people come forward, then they would declare that month to be the beginning of the month. And if no one came forward, then the next day would be automatically, by default, the new month, because it had to be one of those 2 days.
Yeah.
Well, as long as the temple stood, that practice was fine. But what happened when the temple was destroyed and there's no more temple?
Yeah.
How do you declare the months?
Yeah.
Well,
The temple authorities.
You still had a remnant of Jewish people in the land, and they would continue to announce the month and spread the word throughout the diaspora after the Romans had pretty much destroyed the city. But there came a point in time when the enemies of Israel began to light signal fires, because that's how they did it. They would announce that they'd light a fire on some hilltop, and then so many miles away there'd be another hilltop, and they'd light a fire, and another fire would be lit many
like the
hilltops
beacons
away.
of Gondor.
Yeah, and so the enemies of Israel would go and light the fires early,
Prematurely, yeah,
to try and
throw them off.
Yeah. And when that happened, they realized they had a problem on their hands. And so how did they solve it? Well, Rabbi Yehuda the Prince, he was a 3rd century rabbi, a brilliant guy. He was able to,
the Mishnah,
yes, compiler of the Mishnah. The Mishnah being the
core part of the Talmud.
Yes, it's all of the oral traditions, or many of the oral traditions, written down, so that it was captured. But he came up with a way mathematically to calculate in perpetuity all of the beginning dates or beginning days of the months on out for forever and ever.
Yeah. So if you can get it down to a formula, essentially you can know what the moon is going to be.
Exactly.
However many years out, what the moon cycles are going to look like. So essentially, now this brings us. So this is what the Jewish people have been relying on to this day. Then
they have all the calendars. Jewish calendars today are based on that formula from Rabbi Yehuda the Prince. 1,700 years or 1,800 years ago.
Yeah. He might have commissioned an astronomer to figure out.
Or he was a brilliant guy himself, so he probably did it himself.
Perhaps, yeah.
But going back to what you were going with this, is that there are certain groups. So that's the halakha. That's the tradition that we continue to follow. And you could argue, well, he missed it by a day, but overall, it's an accurate formula to follow.
Yeah.
And so we don't worry if it may be off a day here and there. Whether it is or not, I don't know. I've never really paid attention to whether it might be off by a day at times, but regardless, there are groups out there today, not Jewish groups. These are mostly Hebrew roots type organizations that want to
take on the veneer of Judaism.
They want to place themselves within the camp of Messianic Judaism. And again, why are we doing the Messianic Wall of Weird?
Well, this is for the purposes of disavowal. I mean,
yes, because these people are they're claiming space in our camp, and we're saying that is not who we are.
Yeah. So joke that I guess the Messianic wall of weird proves one thing. Greater Judaism might reject us, but there are people we reject too. So
Yeah.
you have to laugh. So yeah. Anyway, go ahead.
So anyway, so this particular group that I was going to pick on is a group out of, I think they're out of Charlotte, North Carolina. It's called the Arthur Bailey Ministries International. And I think they call themselves House of Israel and Arthur Bailey Ministries International.
When you have
and they're
ministries
not
in the title, it's like,
right away.
I just a little excursus here. I gotta say this. Like, there are these words,
buzzwords.
We'll call them buzzwords, and we use them all the time in Messianic Judaism. We shouldn't. So we use words like fellowship and ministry and call somebody brother so-and-so. And like, I don't do this, but there's a lot of people that do. It's like, you could say, there are other words for this, that you can talk about ministry, okay, tikkun, olam, or tikkun, you can talk about fellowship, maybe kahila, you don't have to, I don't know. It's just kind of silly. So whenever I see such and such, Light of the Menorah Ministries. It's like, well, okay, that's right. Right. You put it right in the title. It's like, okay, well, I mean, I'm not, if somebody has a little community thing going and it's working for a group of people, I wish them well and everything, but it's just dead giveaway, dead ringer.
I would agree.
Yeah.
So anyway, they're not alone. They're just an example of a group that's out there. There are many others, but they typically fall under that umbrella of Hebrew roots.
Yeah.
And what they want to do is ignore the calendar, the Jewish calendar that's accepted by tradition, and instead they want to go back to the biblical way of doing it, and we have to see that is the moon.
Yes.
That tiny sliver of the moon, and we have to have two people that are respectable that cite it, and if they don't see it, then we honor the new moon on the next day. So where are they doing? From where are they doing this? So like, if they say it has to be done from Jerusalem. Okay, I'll at least give them credit for that.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, if they're doing it from the East Coast, then they kind of changed the Greenwich parallel.
Right.
they've
right. It creates a problem if you don't do it. The only place that you could do it on the planet would be in Israel.
So they've got somebody there on the ground in Israel to do that.
Apparently so.
Okay.
But regardless, it's just weird. The fact that they're disrespecting Jewish tradition. Yeah, they're not disrespecting. They're flat out rejecting Jewish tradition and saying, "Oh, the rabbis are wrong."
The rabbis, for some reason, just like supervillains who put, I don't know, like those Dudley Do-Right supervillains that like scratch their pencil mustache and I'm going to corrupt this calendar because I can. Then nobody will know. Nobody will know what day is what day. Nobody will know when to have a feast.
Dastardly people.
Even though it's going to affect us too, And so it seems highly unlikely. I'd imagine that the sages of Israel, specifically the Judah the Prince, would obviously have a personal investment in making sure that he himself, as well as the people around him, can properly observe the mitzvot. So, I mean, it's just one of those other touch points at which Messianic Judaism runs the risk, if they associate themselves with this, of just further distancing themselves from the Jewish community. And if you're doing that calendarly, that's really big. I mean, it's one thing to say, I'm going to light the menorah fully all 8 nights because it looks pretty. It's another thing to say, let's have completely different times that segregate us from the wider Jewish community.
And here's where it can get even a little bit more separate or segregated from the Jewish community. Keep in mind that because it's a lunar calendar, and it's only 29 and a half days long, your year is 11 days shorter, roughly, each year than So you have a problem in that. Okay, this year it's 11 days shorter than the Gregorian year. And then the next year it's another 11 days shorter. And
So
the
you
next year
have
it's
to have
another 11 days
You
shorter.
basically have to have like a leap month or something
Exactly.
to compensate. And so,
Roughly every 3 years, in actuality, it's 7 times every 18 years.
yeah.
You have to have a leap year. And a leap year is an entire month that's added to the calendar.
Yeah.
So when do you declare a leap month?
Yeah.
And if you're in these Hebrew root camps,
Then your year is going to be completely overtaken.
you could end up winding up with a year that's different than the wider Jewish world, because if you
And
are
you're just continually diverge in time.
well,
going
you'll
forward.
eventually come back in sync with them
Yeah.
when
when-
maybe do it a year early or a year late,
Yeah.
and so for a year you're going to be out of sync by a whole month with the wider Jewish world. You're
Yeah.
going to be celebrating the holidays on the wrong days.
Yeah. 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 And so it does, I guess, down the line lead to a very wild divergence. And so,
Exactly.
yeah. So yeah, you have to be able to adjust for it. I mean, like, we have in the Gregorian calendar way of dealing with that as well. So, the bottom line is, people have good intentions, and I'm sure that I give them points for diligence. That's always good and everying.
But in some ways, they're they're non-Jews trying to usurp and to I guess in some ways tell the Jewish community.
Oh,
you're
we
doing it
started
wrong.
this yesterday, but we figured it out.
Yeah, we figured out you guys are doing it wrong. Let us teach you and fix you. Let's straighten you out.
Church fathers.
Oh my gosh.
Sorry. Yeah. Anyway, again, I give them props for diligence, but I just have to say that this is probably it's benign right now, but if it's taken seriously or intermitted into wider Messianic Judaism, it can be harmful. And so we have to call it out. And that's why the Moonies belong
on the Messianic Wall of Weird.
Tune in for more great content and ideas at mjnext.fm. This is Drake Dunaway, signing off.
And I'm your co-host, David Cook. And join us right here next time on MJ Next.